Eurovalues Council has the honor to invite Professor Mohammed Cherkaoui from the United States. I would like to remind people who will be watching our discussion session that you are a professor of peace and conflict resolution and former member of the United Nations panel of experts, and you intervene regularly on BBC, Al Jazeera, and other channels. So as I told you, Professor, Eurovalues is a think tank based on Strasbourg on transatlantic relation and European security and defense issues. Eurovalues aims to strengthen European and transatlantic cooperation, defend the principle of democracy, human rights, negotiation, and international cooperation by encouraging an exchange of ideas between the United States and Europe. So the goal of our center is to give the voice to decision makers, politicians, university professors, students, NGO representatives, and journalists to address strategic, diplomatic, and international issues. As you know, Professor Cherkaoui, nobody dared to believe what is happening now in Ukraine, despite the multiple warnings of the Americans for 6 days. The Russian army has crossed the Ukrainian borders. Currently, Russian troops are approaching Kiev, and fighting is underway in almost all Ukrainian territory. So my first question for you, if you permit, Professor Cherkaoui, is how do you see this war from United States?
Well, I'm honored to be with you. And talking of Strasbourg, I had the privilege of addressing the Council of Europe back in 2017. And here again, I'm connecting with you through the Atlantic between Washington and Strasbourg. I think what's been happening now in Ukraine is a war within a war. There is a bilateral war in terms of the Russian aggression, the military intervention, the use of power by the Kremlin to impose a certain will, if you like, on Ukrainians. But there is also a more symbolic, a more geopolitical struggle through the situation and how the Kremlin has been handling it in Ukraine. There is also the Russian Western standoff for the first time in more than 30 years since the collapse of the Berlin Wall and the end of the Soviet Union. For the first time, we are witnessing this showdown of power, especially from the Kremlin, with the hope that the West, either NATO, the European Union, or other Western coalitions would consider the requirements or the conditions of President Putin. So far, we have not been talking on good terms. This is not a symmetrical war because of the differences in how each party is handling it. From the Russian perspective, it's an exercise of power. Putin proposes a greater Russian empire, not only a global power or a superpower, but an empire. So the way it has tried to contain Ukraine is a good indication of this hegemonic and empire-oriented mode of thinking within the Kremlin. On the other hand, the West has opted for avoiding a military confrontation. Therefore, there is a different weapon, which is sanctions, both economic, financial, also banning the Russian banks from the use of SWIFT. Now we've heard of other sanctions coming a long way. So basically, we are at a war that is not symmetrical, as well as the modes of operations. You have the military might coming from the East, and you have the language of political economy coming from the West. So sanctions and tanks are not talking to each other. So what's been happening so far is an attempt to engineer a kind of balance of power. And I think the Russians believe, within the circles of the Kremlin, believe that they have the upper hand. But when we look at how this transatlantic alliance between Europe and the United States has re-emerged so far, there is definitely capability of handling the situation militarily, but the West has opted for a more strategic, which is we don't want to kill civilians because we don't want to have a rerun of World War I or World War II. Therefore, the West is using a weapon of the 21st century, if you like, versus a classical weapon by the Russians, which is war, which reminds us of the horrors of the 20th century. So from a geopolitical perspective as well, we have an issue of temporality, how we examine this war. Is it the classical war, or it's a newer mode that we have not experienced, because the two weapons are different, they are not facing each other. And I presume we need a few months, maybe a year or a year and a half to assess to what extent the economic sanctions will cripple the Russian economy, and therefore Putin and his colleagues at the Kremlin will reconsider the whole situation and maybe opt for a de-escalation mode of this conflict.
So, Professor, you're talking about this confrontation between the West and the East. So 5 days ago, Emmanuel Macron, the president of France, explained that Russia has violated the Charter of the United Nations and the founding principle of the European International Order. He also explained that the Russo-Ukrainienne conflict will have a long-lasting and deep geopolitical consequences on our lives for a long time. So do you think this kind of speech means that we have entered in a new Cold War era?
The statement of President Macron implies two controversies or two dilemmas. One is European and the other is global. For several years, the European Union and most European capitals have considered Russia as an European partner more than an Euro-Asian state. So there was that growing political love, if you like, in a way that Russia can become another an economic ally, because of trade, because of the need for Russian gas and other resources. But now when Russia invades Ukraine and threatens the whole European continental security, it's like causing some disappointment in France, at the Élysée, in 10 Downing Street in London, in Berlin, and among European capitals and political elite, that maybe they were a little bit naive in believing that Russia could be a European ally and a European partner working with the continent, and in a way that the economic trades, as Thomas Friedman called it once in his book 20 years ago, the world is flat. So Europeans thought that Europe and Eurasia were like one flat land where they can build better cooperation and better alliance. The second point I would like to make, in a way that Russia has destabilized global security, we look at the fiasco a couple of days ago at the Security Council. According to the Charter of the United Nations that Russia signed back in 1945 at the San Francisco conference, Russia was supposed to be one of the top great powers to solidify the peace and security duality. This is the essence, or this is the spirit of the UN Charter. But when the Russian ambassador was presiding the council, and he was basically throwing all the arguments out of the window, and it was a moment of very bad, offensive realism, that here I am controlling the president. I am not interacting in a positive way with the other stakeholders, whether the Ukrainians or the Americans or the Europeans in terms of France and Britain and other 10 non-permanent members. At the same time, Putin at the Kremlin was directing his military troops. So we have both a showdown of an ugly sense of offensive realism, both diplomatically, which is not a diplomatic move, by the way. It's basically political stubbornness at the United Nations, both at the Security Council and later on at the General Assembly. So I would say from a neutral perspective of conflict resolution, the Kremlin has threatened, has defied the main component of the mission of the United Nations, and also turned Russia from a partner and a power of safeguarding peace and security into a stakeholder that is bringing us the dilemma of power politics. So it has been an exercise of real politique a la Russian, if you like. Therefore, I could not figure out a moment so far in the past week, I could not figure out a moment where I would see the Russian leadership in Moscow or the Russian ambassador at the UN trying to propose a certain settlement or having some contribution toward global diplomacy, let alone peacemaking and peace building within Ukraine and the rest of Europe. So this is a moment that I think defies even the Cold War era, at least for like 45 years between 1945 and 1990, basically November 89 when the War of Berlin collapsed. For the first time, we are beyond that symmetrical acceptance of each other, which was called la détente. We no longer have a new détente now, and basically, as I said earlier, every stakeholder is waging its own war. Once on the east side, it's a power war, it's a military invasion. From the west, it's just a trade war, a sanction war, and there we are still at this dilemma when it would be a proper time where the Russians, the Americans, the Europeans, the Ukrainians, all these powers, all these major stakeholders sit down, look at each other in the eye and say, okay, now we need to figure out new détente. And no one has shown yet that willingness to consider a new path to an alternative détente. Otherwise, global diplomacy or United Nations diplomacy has become void, basically. It has not led us to any compromise or at least a mode of de-escalation of the situation. And I think we will be at limbo for a few more weeks.
So, Professor, when we look to that invasion of Russia to Ukraine, remember the phrase of Zbigniew Brzezinski, the security advisor, the national security advisor of the United States, in his book The Grand Chase War. He writes that he said that Russia without Ukraine is just a state, and Russia with Ukraine is an empire. So if Putin take Ukraine, will this conflict spread to Europe?
Well, there is a lot of political pride, both in Russia as well as in the West. No one is willing to accept whether Russia remains under the umbrella or part of this Russian empire, as well as Ukraine becomes independent and then it embraces the West. So these are two extreme perspectives that are not fluid, they are not flexible. I would like to add also, which is some symbolic reading I have. I mean, I go back to 1918, 1920, during the Cold War, what Stalin was doing vis-a-vis Ukraine. So I would call it the curse of history that is now affecting Ukraine. Why I'm saying the curse of history? Because for the past 100 years or plus, or more than that, the Kremlin has positioned itself as the protector of Ukraine and other 14 former Soviet republics. But there is that strong commitment and strong attachment to Ukraine for several reasons. That's why we have a war now. We did not have a large-scale war in Georgia, and we did not have large-scale in, let's say, Latvia or Moldova or other states that are in this gray area. Ukraine is also a symbolic asset for the West. That back in 1994. Kiev listened to the advice of the West to give up its nuclear capability. Therefore, Kiev thought it was neutralizing its stance. I would like to add another proposition made by leading defensive realism theorist, John Mersheimer, back in 2015. He said, Ukraine should have been a neutral economic power. In other words, that we should, the West and Russia should not interfere, should not have any claim of either sovereignty or being the protector of this nation. Had we gone along with this choice in a way that you have an international or an internationalization of Ukraine, basically, where no one can claim any rule of or any right of sovereignty. Maybe the political economy of Ukraine would avoid this current situation. In other words, it could have minimized the claims of the Kremlin, and also it would not be a source of concern and nightmare. Basically, Ukraine has been a nightmare for Russians, basically, as long as there is that slight chance that it may become member of NATO, it may become a member of the European Union. And therefore now, I think we have reached this step one. At least the Ukrainians and Brussels are discussing now how Kiev would become a member. The next step, whether there will be a shift within NATO command that maybe also for sake of protecting, I cannot predict what may happen, but things are fluid. So basically, the Kremlin with the leadership of Putin is getting the opposite of what it was seeking for more than 30 years. And now imagine, Kiev becomes another European capital, which is the backyard of Russia. That's the worst scenario Putin would accept. So we need to see how far he and his comrades, Sergei Lavrov and the defense minister, would sit down and reevaluate the situation, whether they are gaining some momentum in proposing a new balance of power, or it may become just failed military intervention. It's not going to stop Ukraine from moving west. At the same time, he is offering the Europeans and the Americans a new life in terms of reviving their NATO coalition, both in military as well as in strategic terms. So there is some miscalculation by the Kremlin at this point, and I think Putin has to consider to what extent he cannot be the ruler of the 21st century. In other words, he cannot be the sole engineer of what he considers a balance of power.
So you are talking, Professor, about the admission of Ukraine in Europe. So as you know, today in the European Parliament, there were discussions for a possible accession of Ukraine to the European in case of admission of Ukraine to Europe. So my question is, Kiev in 2022 will be a new Berlin divided into maybe?
It depends on the political maneuvering of the situation. In other words, we have to consider one thing that is key in our analysis. Is the Kremlin invading Ukraine and controlling Kiev, and then it would stop at this point? Or Kiev and the rest of Ukraine is just a war room, an exercise room where he will be defining new conditions. So I may predict a similar scenario on the Ukraine-Poland border, similar to what was happening before the war, which is a heavy military deployment of Russian soldiers. 190,000 soldiers were, deployed on the Russian-Ukraine borders. So I may look at what happened before the war as phase one, and then we may see phase two of the Kremlin strategy, because basically the Kremlin is not addressing Kiev, is addressing Brussels and Washington and the headquarters of NATO. This is where the message is going, is trying to get through. So if I go back to your question, Kiev would be it would be worse, because there will be a defiance mode of thinking. I mean, Europeans and Ukrainians feel, oh, this is a moment of pride. We are imposing our will. We are turning Kiev into another European capital. But let's turn this upside down. How the Kremlin will be reading this? This is a defiance. This is a no way. So we may have another mode of escalation that we cannot anticipate now. So what I'm trying to say, basically, in a nutshell, we should analyze the situation from a temporal of this moment, this moment perspective, and try not to sort of bring back what was happening before 1989, the Cold War temporal entry. Our point of entry is no longer that period of time. So I think we need to sort of figure out a new diagnosis, if you like, and not just repeating the Cold War and a mode of analysis.
So NATO today, is it capable of dealing with the Russian nuclear threat?
There is a difference between capability and political will. I'm sure NATO has that military capability of addressing a nuclear threat, but when we are at this nuclear age, any little action would destroy the whole continent, if not the whole world. So NATO has been wise not to even consider the nuclear option, even at the 11th hour, but the will now is to turn the table around, basically, in a way that NATO prefers to have its own action and not to be put within a mode of reaction. There is a difference. I always say that the stakeholder that decides the action is stronger, is more influential than the one who has to figure out a kind of reaction. Therefore, NATO leadership has been wise in not addressing the war from a reactive perspective. That's why there has been this difference in terms of how to respond to the Kremlin. I don't think that the nuclear option now is on the table at all, but there is a dilemma how we can save civilians in Ukraine, in Kharkiv, and other Ukrainian cities. I think there has been some bitterness or some kind of disappointment, not only within Ukraine, but also in the Middle East and other parts of the world, that here is a moment where the West does not honor its promises, and now the West has left Ukraine to fight its own war. This is another question that we may consider, but I think that in the long run, there will be some need to go beyond the mindset of power, whether it's the invasion of Ukraine or whether the fear of getting to a nuclear confrontation. Then we need the third option, and I believe that the third option has to come from Europe, between Brussels, the capital of the European Union, in coordination with NATO and other stakeholders within Europe. In other words, that Europe is now positioned to be a partner or a stakeholder that has to shift into a negotiator, someone who is willing to figure out a new compromise. So Europeans are now in this area where the invasion and the military choice and the sanctions as well are not interacting, they are not producing a third or a different outcome. It does not stop the war. It does not change the whole dynamics. Therefore, I say that maybe the Europeans need to negotiate between the Kremlin and the White House how to formulate a new framework of détente where both concerns, Western as well as Russian concerns about security, and where the new line of sovereignty would draw itself. This is something that hasn't been worked out yet.
Okay, thank you, Professor. Because we're talking in our values, my last question for you is that, do you think this Russian-Ukrainian crisis will have a repercussion on the values of Europe?
Well, this is an interesting question. It's not just European values, it's all humanitarian and humane and civilization-oriented values. In other words, if humanity has learned a sad lesson from World War II, and there was a commitment within Europe that what happened between 1939 and 1945 would never happen again, this is a time where political courage is needed. I believe that Europeans have been less enthusiastic about severing their ties with Russia. They have been, for the last 5 years, they have also been considering their own military independence, if you like. The PESCO agreement back in October 2017, how Europeans would develop their their technological military capabilities separate from the Americans. This is a moment where Europe can position itself as the most capable and less power-driven, basically, in a way that if there is hope for better diplomacy to work now and to defy or to come with better results than classical diplomacy. I think what has been happening now is the failure of classic diplomacy, and the Security Council session is a good example, as I mentioned earlier. At the same time, we may need to reconsider a new Reykjavik summit, the one that brought both Gorbachev from Moscow and Reagan from Washington in 1986. This time, I think we need a new Reykjavik on, somewhere in Europe, where you can see Biden and Putin and Macron and Scholz and Johnson, as well as the Secretary General of NATO, Stoltenberg, sitting together and talking seriously about their concerns, their perspectives about the new world order, and everyone would be invited to contribute to what would solidify a new, well-settled, orchestrated balance of power. This is the first time in the last 30+ years we are witnessing a struggle over what and the balance of power means. And I think we need to redefine it. And I would believe also that the Europeans are more capable of handling this hope more than the Americans or Russians.
Thank you so much, Professor, for your participation. Thank you for your answers, and wish you all the best. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good to be with you.
Thank you. Take care.